Hi, this is Paul. Lots of really good comments on this morning's video that I thought I'd make comments on some of the comments. My practice is usually I make my Monday morning video on Friday afternoon after I make my rough draft. And then I will usually put it in No Wait, No Ads over the weekend, and then I'll make sure that it posts Monday morning. And there were some really good comments in No Wait, No Ads that sent me to, I don't know how I missed this video with John Vervaeke talking to Chris Williamson, which very much touched on the issues around psychology and spirituality, which is what Benjamin's video with Andrew Hartz reflected on. So I thought I'd maybe start with the video of John Vervaeke and Chris Williamson, and then touch on some of the comments that I thought were really good. In general, this sort of lines up with the wisdom conversation, which the video I'm planning on making tomorrow, I know some of you don't really like the videos that I make when I clip some of the live streams that aren't on my channel, but McMo has been really cooking on the weekends, and both his Saturday and his Sunday live streams were really good. I haven't listened to the full Saturday one yet, but I've listened to most of the Sunday one, and I'm going to take a bunch of that out because that gets on the question of wisdom generation, not only wisdom in terms of, let's say, the theories that we imagine ourselves to kind of hold to make us smarter or more adept, but much more the 4 P's of wisdom, where Phlebas tells a really wonderful story in that video. And McMo begins with an allegory, but I'm not going to clip the allegory. You can go to McMo's. It's right at the beginning, and you can grab it. But that'll be the video that I make after I finish making this video, because I wanted to make this video because I was just, it's just sort of hot off the press. Because really, this is a Friday video for me, not a Monday. And again, I'm reading the comments on today's video, thinking, yeah, there's some really good comments. But let's go ahead and begin with John Vervaeke and Chris Williamson.
Given that we are biological creatures, why do we need meaning? Why do humans need to do all this extra work in order to be satisfied with life?
Now, even the way Chris Williamson, in my opinion, is a tremendous example of what you can learn by doing what many of us do rather obsessively, which is watch YouTube videos, talk about them, think about them. Chris Williamson, he, in many of the videos that I've heard, has described himself as, hey, he was a good-looking guy who was, if you ever watched the old Steve Martin movie, Roxanne, it's, of course, Steve Martin is competing with what would be called, at least in the 80s, a musclehead, a guy with a very impressive body, but not much brain. And Steve William, as Cyrano de Bergerac, of course, has much more brain, but not much of a body. Well, Chris Williamson started this thing out with a body, but Chris has been growing his brain. And, I think Chris is really impressive, not only in sort of the career he made for himself. He started out doing shows. Well, he started out being a club promoter, which I have no idea what that is because I've never been to a club. But a club promoter, and then he was on shows like Love Island. So he was sort of a classic musclehead, but he wanted to grow in wisdom and knowledge. And so he's done that via his channel and via these conversations with people in terms of reading. And that will get part of the problem of having 2 or 3 videos in my head at once when I'm trying to make one video is all the videos bleed in together. And so that whole question of why it is we're talking on these live streams and why we watch videos only with 100 or 200 views, because they're made by people that we're in relationship with, and what exactly we're doing in the virtually not alone space. Well, that's the next video to come, but I have to refill my water cup. So give me a second. All right. Glass filled. Keep going.
Well, I have to tell you that I've been going through since the publication of the book, I've been going through a serious reflection on this question again and going deeper into it. there's many levels of answering that question. At one level,
Now, it's interesting. Again, Chris starts at as he usually does, as I had to try to sum up to a person who doesn't follow 5 years of my videos what on earth I've been doing. And so I basically had to go over what I call the epistemic revolution. It's this change in worldview that we are currently underway from sort of a reductionist materialist worldview, because a reductionist materialist worldview accounts for Chris's question about meaning, because meaning is such a surprising thing for Chris. Whereas if you start from the other way, which is where someone like Jonathan Peugeot begins, meaning isn't a question. The world is created by meaning, if you listen to Jonathan Peugeot. And so the necessity for meaning is just completely assumed. Whereas if you start at the bottom, like Chris Williamson, well, what on earth is meaning for? And why can't we just be material creatures who are satisfied and satiated by the physical wants that mere survival requires? And what's ironic is Chris's own life is part of that story, because one could argue he began from the bottom up. He began as a musclehead who discovered that he was irrepressibly pulled towards meaning. And so this question is Chris's question. Now, if you go back, all the way back to the early Vervaeke Peugeot conversations, those conversations were all about top-down versus bottom-up. Peugeot was always coming top-down, Vervaeke always bottom-up. Now, John has sort of continued to work from the bottom up, and he's sort of gotten to Neoplatonism, which is a very reasonable place, because part of John is, we all continue to work through the issues of our childhood. And so part of what John continues to work through are the issues of his childhood. And so in Neoplatonism, he hopes to find a ontology that addresses pluralism, the major world religions, and the needs of his soul. Part of the reason that you don't find a lot of Neoplatonists as such anymore is similar to the reason you don't find a lot of Stoics as such anymore, is because in history, so many of them just simply became Christians. Because while you can, and I think the tell is the more recent development of Stoics and Neoplatonists. Again, historically speaking, the assumption would be that they will probably make their own way back to Christianity. But of course, because some of them sort of began in a Christianish way and sort of rejected it, it's flung them way back. And so John Vervaeke's continued to try to work on where he's at with respect to Christianity. And others are discovering it, because they're, like Chris Williamson, continuing sort of to build on naturalist assumptions and finding that man does not live by bread alone, to quote Jesus talking to the devil, because that is Chris's path. And so now Chris begins with this question, well, can't we resolve this? Now, with the part of what has happened where psychology is sort of stuck again is the same issue that Chris Williamson has bumped into. Because while psychology started a little higher up the stack than Chris did, psychology is still bumping into its limits. That psychology is the servant of, let's use a Hebrew word, psychology is the servant of shalom. And while there was a lot of, well, let's just use an individual's personal sense of well-being and shalom, which isn't a bad thing. They've bumped into the limits of that. And again, sort of the classic illustration of that in popular culture is the first season of The Sopranos, where Dr. Melfi, who has to deal with having a mob boss as a patient, and she needs to justify to herself that just resolving Tony Soprano's sense of well-being doesn't necessarily stack up to a greater shalom. Well, great, you've cured him. Now he can be a better mob boss, because Tony Soprano wants to whack people and not have a conscience about it. And he's already fairly along in that process, but he's, of course, the first season, you've got the ducks in the pool and the ducks flying away, and he has these panic attacks. Dr. Melfi has to wrestle with the idea that Tony Soprano getting well needs to not just simply be in sync with Tony Soprano's individualist sense of well-being, but with the well-being, the shalom of the universe. And that's sort of the reason why drugs don't finally work, why Soma in Brave New World isn't finally the answer. You can lay someone in a couch and put them on a drip, may it be heroin or something else, and you'll say, well, they won't live as long, but none of us live that long anyway. We sort of use opioids and heroin with people, not heroin, but morphine when people get to the end of their life, because we can at least give them a sense of well-being. But if we put a teenager on opioids and say, you can have, if it's negative utilitarianism, you can have your most blissful life now by just being a strung-out addict, as long as someone's willing to continue giving you drugs. And that will resolve, ostensibly, the therapist's measure of the eschaton. Well, how do you feel? I feel great. But there you go. All I need to do is be laid out in a bed and being given a continual drip of drugs that someone else pays for, and I'll be great. But mom doesn't think that, and dad doesn't think that, and the friends don't think that. And someone might step in and say, yeah, but they're happy. No, but there's a sense in which my strung-out teenager is violating a deep, meaningful shalom I sense in the universe. And my psychologist doesn't have an answer for that. And again, a big piece of that is the individualism within which the discipline is framed. And so again, Chris Williamson comes to John Vervaeke and says, you know, as biological creatures, what's that meaning about?
Given that we are biological creatures, why do we need meaning? Why do humans need to do all this extra work in order to be satisfied with life?
And again, I can go to one of my illustrations of Goliath. Goliath was a large alligator in an alligator farm in Florida that I visited when my kids were young. And I saw this massive alligator just sitting in this shallow pool, just sitting there. And I said to one of the people giving the tour, doesn't he get bored? And the guy said, no, it's hardly got a brain. We just feed him chicken that we buy at the supermarket, and he'll just lay in that pool and keep growing on forever. And the image, the frame, the religious picture of what a human being is just a a biological creature cursed with an overly large brain. That's the picture. And again, I think part of the reason why we're seeing the surprising rebirth of belief in God, we're seeing all the different movements we're seeing, is that that picture is unsatisfying. It's not beautiful. It's not meaningful. We can't help but imagine we were meant for more. So answer that question.
Well,
The sigh is telling. I'm not sure of telling of exactly what, but
Why do humans need to do all this extra work in order to be satisfied with life?
well, I have to tell you that I've been going through since the publication of the book, I've been going through a serious reflection on this question again and going deeper into it. There's many levels of answering that question. At one level, meaning has to do with sense making. It has to do with how we properly pay attention to the right kind of information that can allow us to reliably solve a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains.
okay. Problem solving, a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains. What is the telos of this? Where does that go? Is it
Wait at the kayfabe stuff. I sent Matt some messages. He probably
Speak
didn't
on
see
it, brother.
them.
Speak on it. Air it out.
I
Air it
haven't
out. Just
listened
keep it
yet.
chill, but
Please.
air it out.
Well, Matt was on stream the other day. I would like to hear everyone's definition of the kayfabe, because a lot of Matt was focusing on like the heel and basically the good guys and the bad guys and how you produce a narrative. But that's like not interesting at all. The interesting part about the kayfabe is how you take, in wrestling, you take a fake event and you weave in a bunch of real elements to make people, basically to confuse people and to buy into the fake event more. So
that's a little teaser, because they got into kayfabe, and if you remember, when I was listening to Michael Sartori and I was sort of piecing together the relationship between kayfabe and enchantment or reenchantment or a sense of enchantment. So you've got the question of, well, what is real? And that's part of what made this live stream so good, was they were getting at that question. And because part of what you have in human beings is we have this splitness, and we have, well, what feels good physically for me, and then what feels good in the upper registers. Well, what do I mean by that? What feels good that I imagine for me in my future? What feels good for the people that I care and love around me? What feels good for, and John's always talking about meaning of life and meaning in life, and that which you would value, that which you values even after you're no longer around to appreciate it. I mean, again, John is sort of always, he's got this ceiling to his upper register because of his wrestling with the question of two worlds mythologies. And so making sure there's no second world above or beyond, sort of a ceiling on that second register, but he's always sort of scaffolding to see how much of that second world he can borrow in terms of its utility in this world. And so, but you're still always knocking on the door of the real. And that's why, again, you look at ontology, epistemology, axiology. The epistemic revolution has sort of brought us below now epistemics and theories of knowledge into questions of being. And so now we're much more interested in the real. And of course, John, I think, is right in that when we talk about the real, it's always a comparative. But that also sort of continues to just beg questions about, are there levels, are there things, are there inside of things that are more real than the things that we can talk about at a particular surface and level?
And that's one aspect of meaning, that sort of agentic aspect. But consonant with that is we need to be connected to other people, because most of our problem solving is done in connection with other people. So there's an initial sense-making dimension. This is often talked about as sort of coherence in the meaning in life literature. Does your world sort of, is your making sense to you, is how I sometimes put it.
Okay, and so now he's going to make an argument, which is a very good argument, about the superpower of humanity as collaboration. But again, we're knocking on ontological doors here, because is it sort of sense making for the sake of, in a Brett Weinstein way, are genes getting into the future? Again, is all of this meaning finally instrumental, but to a degree illusory? Because all that really matters is our genes, our psychopathic genes wanting to get their codes into the future. Or, again, what is really the argument against the billionaire strung out teenager? Let's say if Elon Musk decided, I just want to make my kids happy. Lets them get to a certain age. Why would you have to wait? Put them on a sofa and just put them on a heroin drip and say, I'm just going to keep you on heroin until your life passes away. You can have no suffering in life. It'll feel great. Or maybe you can have a better drug so that maybe it's cocaine. It's just all pleasure for your short life. Because really, what's the difference between an individual and a community? What's the difference between a life that goes 5 years and a life that goes 100 years in the span of billions of years in the universe? And, right there, you just start talking this way and you have a meaning crisis. And again, it's part of the reason why religions are just this astoundingly scalable, meaningful enterprise that is nearly ubiquitous in human history.
Like the sense making is what you're doing sort of automatically, and when you reflect on it, you go, "Yeah, that makes sense. My world isn't absurd," or things like that. And then we need to feel connected to other people, because most of our problem solving is done via other people. That's our great superpower.
Again, it's back to problem solving. Well, what are problems? So problems, again, in a transjective way, problems are something that stands in the way of something else. Well, what is it standing in the way of? Again, we're still back to ultimate questions. And is the ultimate question, the Brett Weinstein, moving my genes into the future? Is that the ultimate question? And that's why, of course, religions deal in ultimate questions, not exclusively, and not, they haven't sort of finished the human conversation yet with respect to those ultimate questions, whether it be the beatific vision or whatever, escaping the cycles of reincarnation, whatever. But you're not going to get away from the ultimate. It's just a fixture of the upper register.
Individually, biologically, as you framed it, we're pretty pathetic animals. A really angry dog can take us out. And
I don't know, that granny took out a bobcat. People when they get going, a really angry dog and Chris Williamson or John Vervaeke, my money's on the human.
So our superpower is we can coordinate together and get some train some of those dogs and sharpen some of those sticks and then kill anything on the planet. And so we need to be connected to other people. And that brings with it its own special problem. My friend Greg Enriquez made sort of prevalent. We developed the superpower of connecting and coordinating called language. And language is something really, really powerful in helping us coordinate, but it also does something really novel. It makes the content of our minds accessible. We're sort of exposed to each other in a way in which no other organism is exposed to its fellow creatures. And so we have to also develop this.
And you know, that question also begins to knock on the door of the question, well, who is we? Is it my genetics, or is it the genetics that I share that we're trying to get into the future? And of course, it's kind of a silly game given the idea that maybe an asteroid or a nuclear exchange or something like that can wipe out our genetics. And so then we're sort of knocking on the door of Brett's big brother Eric and Elon Musk, who are like, well, we got to get off this rock, but you can continue to multiply the rocks, but you're not going to escape these conflicts, because whatever the scale human beings are working on, whether it's two little tribes in a jungle somewhere, because the evolutionary psychologists always love to go back to sticks and pointed sticks and dogs, the fundamental problems with humanity endure. And of course, if you read C.S. Lewis in the middle of the 20th century, Lewis was pointing this out. He was saying, okay, so maybe we go to the stars. By the way, contra someone who made a comment the other day that I don't like the space trilogy. No, I really do. Which should be the Ransom trilogy because of the interesting way that Lewis approaches these things. But we still don't escape these problems. And in some ways, I don't know that if you start from a materialist, naturalist perspective, you ever finally escape the question of whether or not meaning in itself is basically humanity's poison pill, which separates us from the other animals deer will eat themselves, or deer will pop, without a predator, deer will just multiply and they'll hit peaks, and rabbits have population things too. Meaning is our real problem. And so we were able to scale up, and we keep scaling up, and we collaborate and we work together, but we can't endlessly collaborate and work together because they're always just then wind up fighting each other. And so our going from pointed sticks and dogs to nuclear weapons just finally resolves in the same old thing. And if we were just meaningless creatures, then we could have a world in which some people who think that humans shouldn't be around, well, it's just trees and forests and deserts and plants and animals, and no pesky Homo sapien that evolved to end the whole show.
This way of balancing between coordinating with other people but not being overexposed. So we have to develop relationships of trust and forgiveness and belonging, and we have to balance between being individuals and having.
And then you would have to say that all of this trust and forgiveness and belonging and all the feels associated with them, all the feels associated with them are just sort of the biological things that sort of scaffolds up these quote unquote higher faculties that we have. But again, endlessly, they don't go anywhere or mean anything. They're just a function of us becoming an apex predator, as opposed to sharks who have thick skin and tigers who have sharp claws.
An individual identity and a group identity. So that's all central to meaning. And then beyond that, we fall prey in both of those domains to massive self-deception. I don't pay attention to the right things. I misframe you. I'm biased in my attitude towards you. And so we have to do a lot to correct that. We have to try and ameliorate that. And what that means is we also have to be connected to standards by which we can correct ourselves. Standards about what is most real, what is best, what is most beautiful. And that's a deep.
And now these standards, this is exactly when I sort of run through, people today still, I think, don't have an understanding of why Jordan Peterson sort of broke something open like he did. And if you run through the story, basically reductive materialism naturalism had hit a dead end. And this is exactly the dead end. The dead end of naturalism is the meaning crisis. I should write that down so I can remember it for the title. Because once this particular view of the world gets fleshed out to this degree, you can say, well, yeah, maybe it's good that my daddy wasn't a billionaire drug pusher and put me on a table to just give me happiness for my very short life, but I was actually able to grow enough and learn enough, and I was fortunate/unfortunate enough to get enough education by which I began to learn that all of my feels about meaning and purpose and community and love were all simply instrumental aspects affording us to level up from sticks and dogs so we could not only kill mammoths and horses and other large game in North America, but we could kill each other and eventually develop nuclear weapons and end it all. And hitting that limit, now you might say, well, that's just yet another biological limit that we've hit. And so now, and this I think is exactly where Jordan Peterson sort of fits into the narrative, now suddenly we have to turn back to religion, but in sort of a spiral way. So we can look at the spiral dynamics in a spiral way. Well, now we discover, now we have all of this knowledge, this new biological knowledge and this new scientific knowledge, but now we once again have to level up and become Stoics and then Neoplatonists to once more sort of be able to get out of this existential upper register bottleneck that we hit of meaning. But the problem is the meaning crisis is built into the naturalism. You're just going to keep hitting it until you sort of invert things and suggest that maybe material isn't the proper place to start. Maybe, and again, I think John with his Neoplatonism, I don't know, he talks a lot about Neoplatonism, but perhaps part of his Silk Road project is going to be flesh out for us what a 21st century Neoplatonism really looks like, to the degree that such a thing can be embraced by people who don't have IQs north of 125 or disposable hours to read and think, et cetera, or something that can actually be made available to people whose IQs are south of 125 and living in context where they have to burn through 60, 70, 80 hours a week just trying to put food on the table, and in those other hours they're Netflixing themselves in sort of a heroin way to make their other 80-hour work week work.
Deeper kind of connectedness. That's kind of a connectedness to what we consider ultimacy. So I've tried to show you how all of these things are all important dimensions in why we have to pursue meaning in life. I've become increasingly dissatisfied with the standard psychological construct called meaning in life to measure and talk about all those dimensions in a coordinated fashion.
Can you talk to me about the sort of established body of work when it comes to meaning and how you diverge from that, or what you would suggest as an improvement?
Yeah, so the standard metrics are around sort of 4 dimensions, really 3. One is coherence, which I mentioned, which is, does your sense making make sense to you? Another one is purpose. That's not well posed, because if you think standardly of how people think of purpose, purpose is you're working towards some ultimate goal. That's a very dangerous way of framing meaning, because if you never reach your goal, your life was meaningless. And if you reach it, going forward, you're pretty meaningless. And I discovered that way back in high school, and that sort of really bothered me. And so I think what they're talking about more is orientation. And then orientation is a more important way. People have to feel not disoriented, but oriented in the world. And then,
even the turn from propositional tyranny to the four Ps and the turn towards embodiment, I would argue that before propositional tyranny, we had procedural tyranny. And to a degree, the much maligned Protestant Reformation was at heart a way to address procedural tyranny. And because humanity usually just sort of bounces between the guardrails on both sides of the road instead of sort of figuring out how to stay on it, we went from procedural tyranny to propositional tyranny, and now we're moving back to the procedural and the perspectival and the participatory. We sort of went from knowing to being.
The next one they talk about is significance, that you have things in your life that aren't transitory, ephemeral, shallow. But that seems to be just sort of one side of this deeper thing, which is called mattering. You need to feel connected to something. People typically use the metaphor bigger than yourself. I want to be connected to something larger than myself, right? They don't mean that literally, because that would be ridiculous.
They do mean it literally. They don't mean it physically.
Attaching you to a locomotive engine doesn't give you a profound sense of meaning in life. So what's going on there is, I would argue something like this. There's a deep connection between the sense of bigger and more real. And let me try and give you an everyday example of this. When you're in a dream world, you're in this little world and it seems so real to you. And then you wake up. Notice we have all these waking up metaphors and enlightenment metaphors. You wake up, and from that larger world, you can see how the earlier world, the smaller world, is limited in biasing you and warping and thwarting you in you trying to.
It's containment. We had a wonderful conversation recently. I had a wonderful conversation about the affordance of limitations, the affordances of constraint versus the affordances of liberation. Sometimes the removal of constraint, which is liberation, brings affordances, and sometimes the engaging of constraint brings affordances. And so those dynamics sort of cut both ways.
Get a flourishing life. And I think that's what people are really struggling with when they're talking about mattering, about being connected to something larger than themselves. And it's this sense of realness, which I don't think is properly captured just by the psychological notion of mattering. And here's the fundamental thing. I mentioned that meaning has to do with being connected to something that's more real than yourself in some important ways, because it helps make you feel more real to yourself. Now,
I would think that the affordance of constraint goes, now look at the metaphors here, it goes inside and goes deeper. And the affordance of liberation tends to go outside and higher. Now, higher and deeper are tricky because in some ways they connect. But now with real, again, I tend to think the reason we're having this, the way people are finding their way out of the meaning crisis is upper registers. is because we have a sense that if the most real was the material level, there's no point to this conversation. Again, back to the McMo live stream on Sunday, they're wrestling with that because, well, what about kayfabe? Is kayfabe real? And Phlebas was doing a lot of good arguing about its reality or its illusory, and so what you get is sort of this tonos, as Vervaeke would talk about it, a paradoxical tension between between layers. And I think in some ways, as Michael Sartori in the video that he made about kayfabe recently talked about, part of the reason kayfabe came around was because wrestlers couldn't risk injury if they wanted their athletic theatricality to be something that put food on the table to afford a longer life than the billionaire drug pusher's child. Gotta have that note too. So that's part of the reason why this word real, because we're in this transition right now where ontology is once again up for grabs on a broader stage culturally, that this word real is such a tricky snitch.
That's a problematic notion to think of as just purely, I'm just describing something like a standard psychological phenomena. This is actually, if you'll allow me one technical term, this is a normative term. Meaning is, a meaningful life is not a description. When I say your life is meaningful, I'm not just describing it, I'm praising it. I'm saying there's something fundamentally good to it. It's meeting some standards of evaluation. But
now this is something, again, he had just spoken about with Elizabeth Oldfield on the Unheard thing. So one of the things about being sort of a public intellectual is that you talk enough, and John's been talking a lot because he's got to promote his book, and that's sort of the phase that he's in right now, is you sort of get a sense of, okay, what's salient for John right now in terms of his own career of discovery of the world. And so this point is salient.
Those standards of evaluation are completely absent from the standard psychological model. That would be the crux. That's one of my two main criticisms. And so, in a very deep sense, the meaning in the standard meaning in life psychological model is completely divorced from the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. And if you look across all the religion and philosophical traditions, that's not the case. They're deeply wound to.
Okay, so again, back to the Elizabeth Oldfield Unheard conversation. What the psychologist is bumping up against is, in fact, normativity. That's what Dr. Melfi is bumping up against. If I use the tools of my profession and make Tony Soprano a better mobster, he might have a dead reckoning sense of greater well-being, but in terms of higher demands of normativity, it's a failure. The billionaire drug pusher's child is having maximized chemical well-being, but failing larger map normativity, because someone coming in would say a child's life is wasted because of the billionaire drug pusher's metaphysic of negative utilitarianism. The mob boss's life is wasted even though he can have his trophy wife and his guma and his growing kingdom of vice and wealth, etc., because normatively speaking, he is made for a bigger thing than just being a mob boss. Normatively speaking, the billionaire drug purser's child is made for something better than bliss on a couch. And again, you could push the naturalist dilemma and say, no, that's all we're made for. But I think this is why New Atheism bottomed out. This is why Alex O'Connor is on the journey he's on. This is why many people just can't finally let go and come around to religion, and it might take a generation or two, that finally naturalism and biology are too shallow a pond for human beings, which is, of course, Dostoevsky's point. And then you have what to me is sort of a meaning crisis ontological argument that if that is the case with respect to us, now let's fork it. Let's say the naturalists are true. But if the naturalists are right, but this other element is still true, that naturalism is itself a dead end, then naturalists must embrace the illusion, which I think perhaps becomes a sort of Gnosticism, that any reasonable naturalist should embrace religion. And I think that's why we're having this conversation currently about instrumentalist religion, where people say, I'm not sure religion is ontologically true, but it's psychologically satisfying, so I'm going to embrace it anyway. But then you have the problem, then you're just LARPing or doing kayfabe, and you're never going to escape your meaning crisis if in the back of your mind, Phlebas made a great illustration. I mean, to what degree, when Hulk Hogan was in the deep end of his kayfabe, could Hulk Hogan sort of ever really become the character Hulk Hogan, or could he ever really escape being the person, or vice versa? In other words, a human being then in a naturalist worldview is trapped in that tension and can never fully escape the naturalism. And I think this is actually where a lot of people in this space are stuck these days. But they can never fully give themselves to the kinds of affordances and escape that a true embrace of religion would offer. And this perhaps is where someone like Jordan Peterson, or maybe to a degree John Vervaeke, is sort of trapped. They can't give up the naturalism, so they're never actually going to enjoy the religion, which again, from a naturalist perspective, means that, well, the big brain curse is true, because the people south of 125 are those who had at least the benefit of, let's say, being raised in a healthy Christian environment, means that they can, even with their IQ north of 125, enjoy a religious worldview. Happy are they, blessed are they, but also blessed are the low IQ'd who can't see beyond the instrumentality, or even can't see into the instrumentality, and therefore just simply enjoy life with a God who loves them. Happy are they. See, I promised to get into some of the, let me read some of the comments in the video. Thomas Simmons had a great comment. Worked in mental health after college, learned a lot, but felt much of it was already profit driven by doctors. That was 78 to 80. Went to couples therapy a couple of times over the years. Not much there, not really. Now back in the church. And gotta say, if you got a real existential crisis afoot, there's not much help to be found there either. My pastor is 35, my assigned elder 45. I'm 67, forget about it. Nobody's fault, but the only thing I ever had was a very personal relationship with God. I am much more sympathetic now with people who find these institutions coming up short. Better lucky than good, I guess. Yeah, and I think you just have to face the fact that if you're in the church industry like me, we got issues. You know, if I were building a better mousetrap at Living Stones, perhaps the seats would be full. But this is really tough stuff. Mark and Tbilisi, I have a strong suspicion that therapists appeared when priests stopped doing their job. Would love to know what others think about this. This is going to lead into the video that's definitely going to be a separate video where I get more into some of the TLC talk, which I know even Phlebas, who gave some of the best TLC talk in that video, even Phlebas has trouble with, which is it just sort of turns in on itself. But part of what we're recognizing is that we as people do things pursuing shalom that are not terribly efficient, but yet not completely unprofitable. Because, a lot of us have been, on any given day, there's 5 or 6 high status experts. This is part of what's beyond the collapse of the expert videos out there of people that will what? Reliably give me feed my large brain so my biological self can be more successful. What is it about talking with other low status people, whether it's at a local estuary or a Bible study or on a TLC live stream, that sort of is feeding something in me? Where's the value of it? And that's what the next video is going to get into, because that's what that conversation was really getting after. Part of what's happened in church is that, in the body, if there's like a tumor in the way of a blood vessel or something, or a blockage, the body will sort of work around it. I've seen that happen all of my life. So elders are doing counseling, pastors are doing counseling, pastors are getting degrees in psychology, pastors are becoming therapists. Part of the question was, of course, billing. That if you're the pastor of a certain group of people, certain size group of people, but you're also not only working in the church, but working on the church, you've had all of these models that are working to address. And so what happened in, let's say, the seeker movement was, the idea was very TLC in that the senior pastor's job is to cast the vision, preach great sermons, run the organization. The executive pastor was to help the pastor run the organization. If it's large enough, you establish a counseling wing that has a degree of expertise because the truth is that, there are technical, foxy aspects that counselors can address far better than clergy. And in some ways, clergy are lions and counselors are foxes. I was thinking about how the lion-fox thing maps onto Ian McGill, Chris Master, and his emissary, and I think that's true. But part of what's happened in churches is that, for example, we were talking in CRC Voices, or even it was on Aaron Wren's channel, where he had this last video last week about churches and managerialism. You had a church of 1,000 people and one pastor. We'll just do the math. Well, part of it was you had a healthy enough culture that the people could maybe stay healthier, maybe. In mega churches, you basically outsource your pastoral care to small groups. But then, as Thomas Simmons notes, it's a lot's going to depend on what's going on with that small group. And what you're really trusting in is that people hopefully will make good choices about seeking their own healing instead of bad choices and, let's say, using alcohol to deaden the whole mess. Bas Van Os had a super interesting comment. I offer executive coaching and pastoral care. In both types of sessions, we work with physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being and their interactions. In pastoral care, I find there are more ways to help, and I charge nothing, or some form of pay it forward. In executive coaching, clients pay a lot of money, and I don't pray with them, at least not visibly. But I must say, the fact that coaches know that I also do pastoral care does lead to more openness in our coaching sessions. In other words, here we have these secular structures, and let me be clear about estuary. I have intentionally created estuary to be quite secular because of the sensibilities of both post-Christian and pre-Christian sensibilities. So, but what Boss says is true. And it's part of the reason why pastors got into counseling, because in some cases, you can spend hundreds and hundreds of hours with one parishioner and lose your job because you've got the other parishioners to keep happy, you've got a council to keep happy, you've got a building to maintain, you've got budgets to run, you have sermons to prep, you have denominational obligations, you have all of these things. You can't spend, well, how much can you spend? And how much energy can you spend on one wayward sheep? Well, hey, I read Luke 15. God's priority is the finding the lost lamb, finding the lost coin, bringing in the lost son. Fair enough. But clergy are doing this, and so part of the reason a lot of clergy go into therapy is if they really enjoy that aspect, they get paid for it. And they'll often get paid better for it, depending on how good they are with it. So, yeah, Boss, I'm sure, makes, as he just said, he makes real money doing coaching, executive coaching, and he does the pastoral care for free, but he understands the pastoral care is actually worth more. Ethan Cawhey says, I'd like to make some bets. The word mental will start to get used less because what affects the mind affects the body. Consciousness will be seen more and more as body-wise. People will fuse the words consciousness and soul together more and more. Yeah. The growing return of seeing humans as having souls will slowly reshape many political conversations that are currently soulless. And I'll put a time frame of 8 years on it, 2 American presidential cycles from now. Prediction. Bold. I like it. CJ Hawley, 99, says, great discussion. I'm a physician that was burned out by the lack of bridges built between psychology, medicine, sociology, spirituality, and personal value development. So I found like-minded folks to build an evidence-based approach to whole person health and well-being. Then we started integrating this into schools and businesses, and the results were very interesting. Probably the most impactful part is the value transparency among everyone, because everyone has core values. But we can't create win-wins until this surfaces. Our small company is called CAT Health. There you go. A little free ad for you. Do-do-do. The more you know. Whoosh. Yeah, that'll become a meme. Yep, that's this video. Leave a comment.